School of International Affairs here. He is the author of several books, including Mitterrand in Palestine, The Boundaries of Jihad, and most recently, and published by the University of California Press, Apocalypse in Islam. The comment will be Victoria de Grazia, who needs no introduction to anybody here, but can we give her a round of applause for organizing this event? Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I would, in fact, focus on that far west, small part of the Eurasian world island known as Europe or Western Europe in particular. And I will also mostly focus on, when looking at Western Europe, on the countries that participated to the project, if you will, of European integration. Normally, internal developments such as Franco-German relations and external pressures such as the influence of the Cold War are normally mentioned to explain the emergence and the main features of Western European politics and in general also of Western European integration. What I would like to do here is to focus on the impact that decolonization had on Western European countries. And in particular, I would like to focus on one single event, the 1973 oil shock, that in so many ways, at least according to me, can be considered as the last episode of decolonization, of the decolonization phase, as it can be considered as an effort to gain economic independence by certain countries after that political independence had already been obtained previously. And also the 1973 oil shock is a key event in the Mediterranean region during the Cold War era. So before starting off on what kind of impact this oil shock had on Western Europe, we must stress something about the nature. What was actually the 1973 oil shock? Because much of the literature on international relations explains the fourfold increase in oil prices that can be considered as a main effect of the oil crisis as a consequence of the Arab-Israeli war and as an Arab reaction to the material support offered by some Western countries, mainly the US and the Netherlands, to Israel against the armies of Egypt and Syria. I think this is not the way we should look at the oil shock. The oil shock is something much more vast and important than this. If it was not something more vast and important, it wouldn't be quoted in all the books about contemporary history as a turning point in the history, at least of the Western world. In fact, it had three main elements into it. The first element constituting the oil shock was the oil embargo. In their meeting in Kuwait on October 17 of 1973, Arab oil producers decided on a general 5% production cut, to be followed by another 5% increase in cuts each month, and this is what they said, I open commas here, until the Israeli withdrawal is completed from the whole Arab territories occupied in 1967, and the legal rights of the Palestinian people are restored. Furthermore, the OAPEC countries, that is the Arab oil producers, established a total embargo on the delivery of oil to unfriendly nations supporting Israel. That is mainly to the US and once again to the Netherlands. I would argue that this element of the oil shock is the least important of them all. Because the oil embargo did have important psychological effects. I mean, there was a lot written on the newspapers about it. But in reality, in the real world of the energy market, no country was particularly affected from it. In fact, certain countries, and especially Iran, Nigeria, and even Canada, increased production to compensate for the loss in the oil market. Then there is another element to the oil shock, which is of crucial importance. Actually, it's two elements that are one linked to the other. One is the increase in oil prices in December 1973, and the second is the nationalization of energy industry. And one cannot understand the other without taking the two together. I won't explain you the reasons, which are quite complex, why, when in advance of 1973 oil prices were already raising. There's a whole amount of reasons that explain why the oil market had changed from a market where consumers decided oil prices to a market where it was producers deciding oil prices. I will add, but oil prices were increasingly already before the Arab-Israeli war. And the nationalization process, even that had started, as we have heard, before the Arab-Israeli war. Algeria had nationalized its own energy industry in 1971. It was not the first country to have done so. One may even recall that Mexico had done the same thing in the 1930s, but still it was the first Arab country to do that. But from 1971 to 1975, all the oil producers had nationalized their oil industry. That is, conservative oil producers, progressive oil producers, Arab oil producers, non-Arab oil producers, Venezuelan and Iranian that are not Arab oil producers, had both nationalized their oil industry. And why did they do that? That was to gain control, some kind of control over the economy. The third element of the oil shock was broader. It also involved the struggle to create what somebody also here referred to as the struggle for a new international economic order. The battle for an increase in oil prices and recovery of economic independence by oil producers was openly linked to a common battle by raw material producers to reform the order that had emerged in Bretton Woods in 1944. And there's a whole lot of elements explaining this kind of solidarity between oil producers and the rest of developing countries, even countries in the non-aligned movement. In the first summit of the non-aligned movement in September 1973 in Algiers, before the outbreak of the Arab-Israeli war, Boumediene had already managed to focus the attention and the action of the movement on the fight against economic neocolonialism, and the non-aligned movement had embraced nationalization. It had embraced the idea to fair prices for raw materials. And still, while holding the presidency of the non-aligned movement, Algeria promoted the 6th meeting of the General Assembly of the UN in April 1974, that is the famous assembly where this declaration for a new international economic order was raised. But it was not only Arab oil producers linking the battle for oil to a more general battle to change, to reform some patterns of the global economy. A very important role is the role played by Venezuela. If you consider that the Venezuelan oil minister, Perez Guerrero, he was a former Ministry of Oil, and in 1973 he was the head of UNCTAD, United Nations Conference for Trade and Development, that was fully a part of this battle for a new international economic order, and eventually Perez Guerrero became, in 1975, also the co-president of this Conference for International Cooperation, also known as North-South Dialogue, that was the main fora for debates on raw materials development and so on and so forth. If you consider these three elements of the oil shock in 1973, can we say that they had an impact on Western Europe? Yes, they had. The oil embargo did affect the foreign policy of Western European countries. It helped the drafting on November 6 of a declaration of the European Community on the rights of Palestinians. One can even say that from 1973 there is a certain consensus that will probably change later, but an emerging consensus of all Western European countries, with the possible exception of the Netherlands, on a pro-Arab potential foreign policy. At the same time, the oil embargo speeded up a process that was already underway, actually, of the elaboration of the first and only document ever drafted defining European identity. An effort which led on the 14th December of 1973 to this Declaration on European Identity, which had specific reference to the historical links with the countries of the Mediterranean and the Middle East. And it actually uses a very Brodelian, because Brodel has been mentioned so much times here, a Brodelian language. On a more strictly diplomatic level, the oil embargo is also was instrumental in the setting up of the Euro-Mediterranean dialogue at the beginning of 1974. It forced the completion of the global Mediterranean policy, which in practice were 8 bilateral agreements with 8 different countries of the Mediterranean, signed by the European Community between 1976 and 1977. All these things might or might not have had a significance on the longer run, but they did mark as a change to the situation of before 1973, that was in so many ways dominated by a mainly colonial approach to the countries of the Mediterranean. The second element of the oil embargo, the increase in oil prices and the nationalization processes, even these, they raised an enormous impression on Western European public opinion and on political leaders. But I would also stress that it had quite a different effect to what it had in the US, because by so many Western European politicians of the time, actually what had happened seemed as an opportunity, and not only something you had to fear. The oil shock helped to highlight the public awareness on the question of growth. That's when everybody, writers, intellectuals, politicians, were re-questioning the idea of growth and whether growth only had to mean increase in production. And there was a lot of speaking about the quality of growth, the limits of growth, the relationship between growth and the environment, between growth and society at large. And basically it was mainly the socialist, the Western European socialist leaders, people like Brandt, like Palme, like Kreisky, for example, in this very important meeting between these leaders at the end of 1973, they actually agreed in this meeting in Schlangenbad in December 1973 on the need for an increasing role for the state in order to invest in things that, such as railways, as opposed to the car industry, that would help to redefine growth and redefine the role for the state. But it was not only a European thing. The Canadian Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, not only he created a national oil company in 1975, but he was part of this debate about an increasing role of the state and different role of the state. If you will, oil prices also had the effect of making the bilateral agreements between Western European governments and single oil countries explode. That's the time, the middle of the 70s, of the agreements between the French and the Saudis. The French agreed to buy oil for 10 years, and in exchange they'll give weapons to the Saudis. It's not the time of the market, it's quite a lot the time of state intervention in the economy. And also, for example, the thinking of Italian communists. When Enrico Berlinguer, the chief of the Communist Party, wrote about austerity, what he called the politics of the austerity, in the second half of the 1970s, it's all linked to this debate generated also by the oil crisis. The third aspect in which the oil shock affected Western Europe was even in its diplomatic struggle for a new international economic order. Even this affected the way Western Europeans acted in foreign policy. It led, for example, to the French government, the French president Giscard d'Estaing, his convening in 1975 of the Conference for International Economic Cooperation, also known as North-South Dialogue, which ran from 1975 to 1977, a conference where issues relating to raw materials, to development, to debt were all taken together. And if you will, the creation of the G7 as a Western place where to discuss the international economy is incomprehensible without looking it in parallel with the creation of with the convening of the Conference for International Economic Cooperation. The French government and the German government openly linked the two. They wouldn't have agreed to create a G7 without the US agreement to create this other conference. But also, this debate on the new international economic order and the pressures coming from in what in that moment seemed a common front of developing countries was crucial in explaining the innovative nature of the Lomé agreements that the European Community signed in February 1975 with countries from Africa, Caribbean, and the Pacific. It was innovative because these agreements included a guarantee for export earnings, and this kind of structural guarantee for export earnings was very much something that those countries, and not only ACP countries, but the rest of third world countries, were asking from Western governments since the 1960s. Let me just, I mean, this is a short story and it's next episode. Let me just try to, from this to, let's see if it can lead to some conclusions. I'm trying also to base myself on what I heard previously. I think, yeah, the Cold War was basically the framework in which many of this interaction between the north and the south of the Mediterranean took place. Maybe the Cold War was not empire building by other means, because in so many ways, we have heard before, we can even say that the Cold War, I mean the fact that there was a competition between the Soviet Union and the US did help decolonization. But we can say, as I've heard before, that the main thrust of the Cold War was, at least into the 70s, the increasing role of the US in the region. And as such, the Cold War certainly explains the limits of the Western Western European political autonomy in the 1970s, and it possibly explains the failure of the Euro-Mediterranean dialogue at the end of the 1970s, and possibly it also explains why intra-European relations got more difficult at a certain time. But that is not to say that the Cold War is or can be seen as the main explanatory factor for what is happening in the Mediterranean. Something like the oil shock actually renders the connections and the reciprocal influences. They're not influences going just in one direction. They're not influences going just from Western European countries to Mediterranean countries. There's something coming back. That's the novelty of decolonization. The influence is not anymore, as in colonial times, going in one direction. They're reciprocal influences. And something like the oil shock renders it only more visible. So I think that how looking at the Mediterranean can help us in three different ways of thinking what we're thinking at this, and also thinking at something like the oil shock, at thinking what we're thinking in this conference. In the first place, it can lead to reconsider the importance of the Cold War as an exclusive explanatory factor for Western European, also foreign policy choices after the 1960s, and bring in the consequences of decolonization. Second, it can contribute to stress the Eurasian and Mediterranean dimension of Western European foreign policy, but it should even contribute to stress that dimension of European society and of the persistent role of links, of a culture, of a political and of economical nature established during the colonial times and possibly even before that. Even though after 1956 these countries, European countries, might not have been anymore the main military actor in the region. And thirdly, I would like to suggest to colonial historians, that is the historians that study European colonial empires, not to end their analysis of the foreign policy of former colonial powers in 56. That's what they normally do. They go up to 1956 and then they say, okay, France decides to participate in the European integration process, so it's historians of the Cold War or of European integration that should study France. No, they have to engage in the later period, even though this period is different than before. And I think one particular issue on which colonial historians should dwell, and that has never been mentioned here, is the way in which things like emigration affected the movement of people from one part of the Mediterranean to the other, which is linked so much to the building of colonial empires before, changed, affected European politics and European foreign policy in the later period from the 70s, 80s and 90s, and that is very visible even in a country like Italy today. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for your stamina, your presence. It feels so good to be here because it's not only a wonderful view, it's not only a wonderful day, it's not only spring in Cairo and winter in Manhattan, but it's a whole cycle, personal cycle, because this conference is an echo, a sequel to the one that Victoria, Rachid, Henri held last May at the International Diplomatic Academy in Paris. And this was the very morning when I learned that I got the visiting professorship at Columbia. So all this is blessed with I don't know how many good feelings. So you are exhausted, I stand between you and well-deserved relief, so I won't be long, and I would like to focus to collateral casualties of Cold War in the Mediterranean that are seldom dealt about. I'm talking about diplomatic relations. My argument is that the French-Israeli relationship was badly damaged because of the logic of Cold War. And two periods that I will discuss, De Gaulle and Mitterrand. So very different logic in both cases. I will address it from the point of view of France. Word during the presentation by Henri about how Israel built in its new role, its new strategic position as being the best ally of the United States in the region, and that it was a very conscious and articulate and strategic choice, and it clashed with France in those two periods. And that didn't mean that neither de Gaulle nor Mitterrand were not staunch supporters of America during the Cold War. Just recall two facts that dealing with what is the heart of the Cold War, which is the integrity of Europe and the American territory. During the missile crisis of Cuba, there is famous exchange between de Gaulle and the Soviet ambassador at the Elysee, and he comes in as a very threatening tone, and he say, so we're going to launch missiles and this and that. And so de Gaulle, very de Gaullian, say, well, then see you in hell, which was exactly the message that was conveyed to Moscow by the envoy the same day. Mitterrand, during the missile crisis of the 80s, when his fellow socialists in Germany were pretty pacifist, he had this famous quote, missiles are in the east and pacifists are in the west. And he supported absolutely the deployment of Pershing missiles on German soil. So there were certainly Cold Warriors when it came to Europe and America. But they considered that the third way was possible, especially in the Middle East. And this clashed totally with the Israeli vision in both cases. And especially, this is always the French touch and special relationship with Lebanon, because as you know, it's not only diplomatic relations that can be crushed by the Cold War, by the weak parties, and in that case it's really Lebanon when it comes to the Gaulle and Mitterrand. In the case of Mitterrand, it's also the Palestinians and the PLO. So, in both cases, they are pretty good supporters of Israel, which is why I made this argument of saying this is a Cold War logic that really destroyed and Israel quite aptly built a legend, a narrative about French being betraying the relationship, while in fact it was the conscious choice by Israel to change horses, if I may say. Because if you're talking about the 60s, and I'm talking about de Gaulle, I'm not talking about the Fourth Republic of Nolan. De Gaulle, under de Gaulle, that 20 Super Mystère, 72 Mirage 3 were sold, Super Front helicopter, new generation of Mirage 5. During de Gaulle's time, that 385 tons of uranium were delivered to Israel, which, as you know, helped to build very sophisticated installation in Dimona, so sophisticated that the United States intended to monitor the whole thing, because they were, of course, conscious that something was cooking. But at the same time, de Gaulle, and it will be the same for Mitterrand, were advocating for full implementation of the UN resolution in the Middle East. So you have always this idée de grandeur, nostalgic grandeur, the idea that France is powerful because it is a permanent member of the Security Council. True, but there was also the idea that the United Nations was the only place where you could neutralize the antagonism between America and Soviet Union. And in that case, de Gaulle's strategic analysis was very clear. He was calling for the four powers, because at that time it was the problem with China, and he was really perceiving the Middle East crisis as a sideshow of the main Cold War raging in Indochina, and you know how critical he was, the Phnom Penh speech in '66. He was certain American forces would never achieve victory. So he was afraid that he was trigger a third World War. He's speaking often about that. And he said, if you had Middle East on the top of Indochina, then we're ready for disaster. So France's attitude in the Middle East in '67 was consistent with his criticism over the Vietnam War and his withdrawal from NATO integrated military. This more independent stand was increasingly supported in France by the Communist Party, while it generated heated debate among the ruling right wing, which split between nationalist and pro-American voices, and while it split the left between the pro-American socialists and the pro-Soviet communists. So during the month of May 1967, you see very clearly that France asked Moscow to rein in the Syrian leader. They think they can stop the Palestinian guerrillas' infiltration from Syria into Israel. They're afraid it will trigger a major conflict. And they're pushing for a four-power move at the United Nations to deter the conflict. And you have, at the same time, instruction from de Gaulle to the envoys, especially at the UN, to avoid any tripartite initiative that between France, America, and Britain that would be perceived as hostile by the Soviet Union. It was a time when the Quai d'Orsay feared a Soviet gamble on, I'm quoting, a limited military confrontation between Israel and its neighbors in order to strengthen its hold over its clients. So the fear from the French were towards Soviet Union, Russia. De Gaulle could never speak about Soviet Union. There was something, in his hardware, he always spoke about the Russians. So the four powers format was a French formula to bring the Russians in, but also to neutralize Anglo-Saxon military initiative. You know that at that time, Harold Wilson, the British Prime Minister, was secretly enrolling foreign powers to join a naval escort aimed at monitoring the freedom of navigation in the Gulf of Aqaba. But on May 28th, so Alexei Kosygin, the Soviet Prime Minister, wrote to de Gaulle about the crisis in the Middle East, and he discarded the possibility of any four powers consultation, and he put all the blame on the US administration. So de Gaulle took good note of this rebirth, saying he was aggravating, of course, but at the same time, he didn't fall back on the tripartite format at the UN. And it was the same even during the crisis in June, and the position was made very clear to Abel Eban when he visited de Gaulle. It was made even clearer at the eve of the conflict on June 2nd, when there was a statement by the government, the Council of Ministers in France under the Fifth Republic is presided by the President, is chaired by the President of the Republic, and the statement was such: the state that would be the first one to use the weapons, no matter where, could not expect France's approval and certainly not its support. Despite that, and despite the fact that after 24 hours, everybody knew that Israel had started the war, and the Soviets called it the French, saying, well, who is responsible for the aggression, so what are you going to do? De Gaulle made no public declaration on that crucial point. He even authorized on June 7th one delivery of war materials, including crucial spare parts for the Mirage fighters that Israel had already paid for. It was only after this unpublicized shipment that military delivery to Israel came to an end. So during this offensive against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, Israel never worried about French military supply, and one could say, I'm not very proud of it, that French weaponry won this war. So at the same time, faced with a military disaster, Egypt tried to convince France that the United States and Britain had lent air support to the Israeli offensive. And this was the time when American embassy, consulate, and cultural centers went up in flames all over the Arab world because, Nasser had said so nobody believed. That was quite natural at the time. But there was also the time when there was a very hostile campaign building in Israel and in the United States against France backstabbing Israel during the conflict. Despite that, because de Gaulle can be very quick, he was really a monstre à sang-froid when it came to international relations. More realist than him, Kissinger can go back to the kindergarten. He resisted Soviet pressure to sanction the Jewish state, and the Soviet campaign was very strong in mid-June. And there is this incredible meeting, face-to-face meeting, on June 16 with Kosygin. Soviet Prime Minister is on his way to the UN General Assembly in New York, and where he will issue a vicious attack against Israel. And so I would just quote a part that the whole thing it's more Gaulian than you would imagine. So De Gaulle, the war just stopped a few days ago. De Gaulle is already speaking about the next. He's already, seeing the next crisis. And he says that if there is no settlement, if such an agreement could not be reached, the Arabs will try to get revenge. They will accumulate forces to reverse what took place. The United States will support Israel in this competition and in this armed competition. There will then be very serious international complications since you and the United States would take sides on this issue and would soon appear on the opposite sides. We would then see that the Arabs mean very little, that Israel means nothing, and that the rivalry between Americans and Russians is the heart of the matter. So you can be De Gaulle, you can be the savior of France, and be totally wrong when it comes to the Middle East. But that was really his vision, So, and it's incredible how his Cold War vision led him to adopt anti-Cold War logic in the region, because he wanted to avoid the sheer consequences of this Cold War logic in the Middle East. But what really topped everything was when Israel raided the Beirut airport on December 28, 1968, destroying the civilian Lebanese fleet as a retaliation against the Palestinian attack on an Israeli plane in Greece. The special relationship between France and Lebanon had been targeted. Also, Lebanon was the only Israeli neighbor to have kept neutral during the Six-Day War. And Israel had conspicuously used French helicopters to strike at Beirut airport. That was what made, De Gaulle mad. Les gazelles. They used the gazelle. They used gazelle to destroy Caravelle. That's something you shouldn't do. Yeah? So he ordered a full-fledged military embargo on Israel little more than 18 months after the end of the June 1967 conflict. So the whole four powers formula proved absolutely ineffective in diffusing Middle East tension. The long-term vision of De Gaulle led him to welcome in May 1968 the first Vietnam Peace Conference. But his neutrality, proclaimed neutrality in the Israeli-Arab conflict, didn't develop into a mediating role since it clashed with Israeli preferences. And the Israeli military establishment had long before the Six-Day War planned to switch to the United States as a critical supplier of advanced weaponry, choosing, for instance, the Patton tank against the French AMX-30. So the escalation of the crisis in May 1967 and the dramatization of the threat facing the Jewish state intensified the accusations against France when De Gaulle refused to lend his support to any Israeli preemptive strike. This is the origin of the myth of the French betrayal of Israel when De Gaulle supposedly stabbed in the back the Jewish state fighting for its survival. This was the beginning of what is called the French Arab policy, when, of course, echoing what has just been brilliantly presented by the oil shock, all that happened after that, the North-South dialogue, and in fact, the real Gaulian in that sense, and I'm speaking under the control of Henri Laurence, is not even Pompidou, this is Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who goes really to push the logic of this new policy. And then you have the Venice Declaration, 1980, that is the European response to the Camp David agreement, and again, with a clash with Israel, but also with America, and with, for the first time in France, a full-fledged campaign for a sanctioned vote by pro-Israeli supporters against Giscard d'Estaing in support of Hitler. So maybe, because I'm French, but during the second Cold War, of course you have Europe, you have European being active in the area, but really European positions are French drafted positions, you know, and I saw the text. I saw the text before and after. The French who come to the European Council, they say this, usually it's adopted. It's very little nuance. So when they say Venice, it's Venice, so you have right of self-determination, and so on and so forth. But when it's Mitterrand who say, let's help Camp David, then suddenly Venice is proposed. And when Mitterrand will come back and say, let's help PLO, national rights and so on, you will have also, this is just to explain why I'm focusing on France and not on the broader European diplomacy, because this is basically how it went. So just, again, this Cold War logic. Here, it's not Mitterrand inheriting a relationship as de Gaulle had and trying to make exploration. It's Mitterrand as a self-proclaimed rebuilder of the French-Israeli relationship and committing himself to visit Israel during his first year at the Élysée, doing it, a state visit, the first state visit to the Holy Land since King Louis IX. French really have sense of proportion. That was the way it was put in the Agence France Presse. The first state visit since Saint Louis. Why not Louis IX? Saint Louis. So
why's that? That was no state visit. That was a crusade.
Probably the guy. It was before Wikipedia. So he went to the Quid. And you remember the Quid? And he looked. Anyway, so you had all this, that even before the state visit, there were, because Begin and Sharon, they had their own plan. And their plan was very clear, and was totally in line, and this is what Rashid said before. Syria and PLO are Soviet pawns in the game, and we are the best ally of the United States in this new Cold War, and we are going to smash them on behalf of America. And here, all the neo-Cold warriors, with of course some a little bit more enthusiastic than the other, Alexander Haig being the toughest of the lot, and therefore being deposed in the middle of the invasion of Lebanon. But the whole logic was very clear. The whole logic was very clear. And France tried to play, another partition. That means what?
20 minutes are up, so you should be
It's
winding
over.
up.
Okay. Already 20 minutes?
Yes.
I don't know when you started. So the whole idea was that they tried to develop, this UN resolution for, the neutralization of Beirut in June of 1982. That was a veto from the Americans. Then you had the multinational force, first to evacuate Rafah, then coming back after Sabra Shatila. But it was even worse because the Cold War logic went full-fledged. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy because suddenly Andropov and he sent the incredible amount of weaponry and advisors to Syria, and really, at one moment, the whole Cold War by proxy really happened in a country where it shouldn't have happened, which was Lebanon, on the Souk el-Harb-Shweifat front line in September '83, when you had, I was there, I saw that a lot of people who have been, you've been trained, in Odessa, Odessa, fine, and you, Moscow, interesting, all Lebanese militiamen, PSP, communists and all that, all coming with Soviet, training, Soviet, and on the other side, the famous General Aoun, defending the free world, with the New Jersey, cruising the borders. And so in that case, not only France was smashed, not only the French relation with Israel was smashed, but Lebanon was smashed. And second on the list was PLO, because the whole Inchikak, dissident movement could not be countered because of Soviet backing Syria. Even they were not pretty happy, but they had to let it go. And it was France trying to protect Arafat in succeeding in saving him from Tripoli after having saved him from Beirut. So the whole Cold War logic went again full-fledged. And just to mention two last points, of course you had the Israeli raid on Tunis in 85, so against the PLO, that was supported by America, and America supporting an aggression on Tunisia. That was something totally unparalleled, and France was the only one trying to temper this logic, and always trying to push at that time with Gorbachev so it was not the four powers anymore, it was a preparatory committee for international conference for peace in the Middle East. And the last point is, of course, when the Cold War ended, France thought, and Mitterrand thought it was the opportunity to relaunch a UN-sponsored peace process in the Middle East, where France would have, of course, been pretty active. But I remember at that time I was diplomatic advisor to the Minister of Defense, and I was saying, no way, it's a new world order. It will be Pax Americana 150%, and that was Madrid, with just a sweetener for Soviet Union that was living its last weeks. So, French-Israeli relationship badly damaged, and of course, all the guilt was put on France, but also one could, and that could be the topic of other debates, was the whole idea of four powers, of UN-sponsored peace process, I don't know what, really feasible, because in fact it made sense during the Cold War as an antidote to the Cold War, and the moment the Cold War was over, nobody talked about it. Thank you.
In some ways, I feel like we've come full circle here, a very big circle. It started by thinking about the whole problem of the Cold War in the Mediterranean with this Sarkozy election campaign and then effort to relaunch a Euro-Mediterranean. And at that point, I also read the work of a colleague, dear colleague, of yours, Gaston Salamé, Lebanese, now the head of a new school of international affairs in France, which is tied to Columbia, who had taught here. And what seemed to me very clear was the immense awkwardness of this French strategy, that is this sort of neo-Gaullist strategy of Sarkozy, very, that, okay, we're going to sort of not deal with the Palestine-Israel question directly because we can't really involve ambiguity involved. We will try to deal with the problem of Turkey by putting Turkey not with us, but down with them. We will use our special relationship, historic relationship with the Mediterranean to speak to the Mediterraneans, kind of francophone gesture. And of course, this will also deal with setting up a framework of some sort of neo-capitalism. It was not too clear exactly what it would be, but certainly lots of capitalization, financialization of small-time development on the northern, the southern part of the Mediterranean, North Africa, and so on around. And this would reintegrate Europe and the Mediterranean. So it was quite remarkable. At the same time, you couldn't hear the Mediterranean speaking, yes, that sounds like a great idea. It was, in many ways, a very colonial gesture outwards. So this kind of response of 2007 sort of harks back to, okay, what happened? I mean, I guess my initial problem was Europe being separated, or the Mediterranean separated, and that's already a slightly Orientalist vision, when Europe and the Mediterranean. But so what happened? In other words, how did the great powers shifting around? And I will accept Henri's bigger, longer, that this is great powers moving around as part of the story, because then there are all the nations and peoples who are acting within this. And so as I hear the two papers, I guess I'm not sure if it's contesting or elaborating a narrative that I might set up like this, okay, try to position two papers. Coming out of the 1930s, there had never been probably more significant, maybe, the world of Philip II, but certainly the integration across the Mediterranean, if you want to call it, with the big imperialist culmination of the imperialism of the first half of the 20th century. There couldn't have been more connection, if you want, old connection, Jewish communities around the Mediterranean, which were still not intact, but they were still around. There were commerce, and then, the Italians wanting their empire, the revival of Romanness, the use by France of Algeria and North Africa for food. I mean, there was a lot more integration economically than there had been before, reinforced by all kinds of barter and other imperial relationships, and a large amounts of money also going in, certainly on the part of the Italians, and the Germans were drawn in as well. So you're getting quite a lot of both competition and actual integration. And that's broken after World War II, so initially. And I would agree with you, it's not broken in 45, it's not broken in 48, the Italians are being pushed away, at least diplomatically, and it's not 56, it goes beyond. It's sets of movements. So there's a whole history which one could call decolonization. And the question is it ever separate from the point that Henri was making, that this is shifts of great powers? In other words, you could say Cold War from the get-go. In other words, from 45, the battles are set. So there's always a question, what is the relationship between decolonization and Cold War? And I have some trouble unhooking that. In other words, saying you've got decolonization and then you've got Cold War. And so around some points, I could just sort of raise the question. Clearly, 1956, that's decolonization and Cold War. I mean, the Cold War is acting there, and that's a huge breaking point for the overreach of the British and the French. And it's always been argued that the big payoff for the French as a result of the Suez War was European integration. The road from 56 to 59, 58 is very quick. So there's a kind of turning in, and the big payoff then is you stop being a mercantilist empire, which with very low growth rates, and you return to Western Europe and integration, and and to a very different kind of deep market, using local resources with a lot of pullback of capital, something that I don't think has been studied. I sort of knew about it because supermarket capital invested in Europe apparently does come from the withdrawal of colonial capital. The Bank of Suez and so on. It means that you've got a lot of capital, and that is one of the most valuable investments between land and big distribution. A second point, clearly, is the development of the European community. Clearly, yes, it's got a configuration. Is it conditioned by the Cold War? Well, probably in many ways. You can't say that the European common market agricultural policy is a result of and connected immediately to the Cold War, but certainly that has enormous effects, especially when an American model of development comes in, which is based on petroleum, big distribution, which favors very much European, sort of kind of European agricultural development, and also a distribution chains that don't use North Africa at all for food, for products from around the Mediterranean. They're coming because of the scale from South Africa or from Israel, from the new areas where you can have a more advanced agriculture. And that, I think, comes out from Adam Tooze's work, the the way the agricultural policies are set up as enormously damaging to North Africa in the long run, also because there's no big change of regimes, agricultural regimes, with heavy capital investment in those areas. So that's, if you want, another area of separation. And then, I mean, I think we can go on that we find these dates, 67 after the wars, the expulsion of the Jewish communities around, certainly in North Africa. That's an enormous, that it would form a kind of cross-Mediterranean connective tissue. That's very, very debilitating. And then we can go on to 73 with the oil shock. Now, there, I guess I'm not sure if those policies add up to much in the 70s, these sets of reactions. And I wonder if that doesn't then link up to your work, that they have stronger roots, an effort to create a post-colonial or a neo-colonial settlement